Hello, and welcome to Snore Lore, the channel where history is soft-spoken, long-winded, and just dull enough to help you fall asleep, or at least question why you were ever interested in history in the first place. If you're new here, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or staring blankly into the void for a few seconds before deciding to do neither. All are valid options, and here at Snore Lore, we support your passivity. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Perhaps you're already in bed, resting your weary head on a pillow filled with comfort, dreams, and modern orthopedic support. Or maybe you're on a couch somewhere, earbuds in, attempting to ignore the chaos of existence. Wherever you are, whenever you are, I'd like to know. Leave a comment telling me what time it is where you're watching and what corner of the world you're drifting off from. Time and place. That's it. No oversharing. This is still Sparta, after all. Speaking of which, tonight's episode is called Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in Ancient Sparta, which is, admittedly, a bit confrontational, but if it's any comfort, no one would survive a day in ancient Sparta. Not comfortably, at least. Certainly not with both kidneys functioning, and absolutely not with a coffee in hand. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Sparta was cool. They had muscles and spears, and that movie where everyone yells and nobody wears pants? And yes, that's true. Sparta has a reputation for being bold, heroic, and uncompromisingly masculine. But what they don't show you in the movies is the black vinegar blood soup, the communal whipping ceremonies, or the complete absence of personal space, pillows, or emotional vulnerability. Tonight, we'll gently stroll through the Spartan way of life. We'll begin with the geography, the rocky, sun-drenched, olive-strewn land of Laconia. Then we'll ease our way into the daily routine, starting at dawn, ending with cold darkness, and in between, a strict menu of physical pain, communal discipline, and bland cuisine. We'll cover what it was like to be born in Sparta, if you were even allowed to live past inspection. We'll observe the training of boys, the strength of women, and the oddly bureaucratic cruelty inflicted on the enslaved helots. And yes, we'll touch on battle, but only in the dry, theoretical sense. No yelling, no slow motion, just formation tactics, shield angles, and stern, judgmental silence. But don't worry, there's no pop quiz at the end. This isn't a classroom. It's a gentle, meandering conversation, one-sided of course, where I talk at you very slowly, until your eyelids betray you. Here at Snore Lore, we believe history should be a little boring. Not because history isn't important, but because sleep is more important right now. And frankly, if you were in ancient Sparta, sleep would not come easily. They didn't believe in softness. They didn't believe in naps. They didn't believe in you, frankly. If you were lucky enough to be born a Spartan boy. Whew, congratulations. You've just enrolled in the Agoj, a government-run childhood program combining education, indoctrination, and violence. If you were a girl, you'd spend your days running, wrestling, and building the future generation of warriors, which is probably still better than being a helot, an enslaved agricultural laborer who got stabbed for sport. If you were an adult male citizen aspatiate, your life would revolve around training, war, and eating black broth in a room full of other deeply repressed men. You wouldn't live with your family. You wouldn't pursue a career. and you certainly wouldn't be watching YouTube videos in bed. So, once again, thank you for tuning in to this deeply unpleasant reenactment. A reenactment not of glory or battle, but of the dull ache of an ordinary day in a society obsessed with pain, control, and rigid perfection. And if that doesn't sound relaxing, well, just wait. There's plenty of monotony ahead. We've got geography, we've got food descriptions, we've got stern, underfed teenagers stabbing shadows in the dark. This is a safe space for boredom. This is a pillow fortress made of olive oil, leather sandals, and centuries-old trauma. As always, I'll be your host, a voice with no real expression, delivering Spartan facts at the pace of a turtle on a hot rock. There will be no dramatic music, no shocking revelations, just soft exposition, long silences, and the occasional passive-aggressive observation. And if you find your thoughts drifting, that's fine. Let them wander. Let your mind gently slide away, past the blood-soaked sands of Thermopylae, past the stern stone walls of the Spartan barracks, until you're asleep, or pretending to be, so no one asks you to do chores. Remember, you are not expected to retain any of this information. You are not being graded. There are no pop Spartans under your bed. This is Snore Lore. We are here to remind you that sometimes the best way to appreciate the past is by sleeping through it. Now, let's begin. Your eyes are heavy. Your room is quiet. And somewhere in a very different time, a Spartan is quietly judging your posture. Arriving in Sparta, the culture shock. As we leave the plane of reality and let our minds drift through the ether to another time, we encounter first our bird's-eye view of Sparta. Let us dive further into the history of this expanse of land. Sparta, or Lacedaemon as it was formerly known, was located in the region of Laconia, in the southeastern part of the Peloponnese Peninsula in Greece. Surrounded by mountain ranges on 3 sides and a river valley on the 4th, it was both geographically secluded and naturally defensible. The Taygetus Mountains formed a towering western wall, while the Parnin Range rose in the east. The city itself sat in the broad and fertile valley of the Eurotas River, which meandered calmly through the landscape, neither particularly mighty nor picturesque, but dependable in its steady presence, much like the Spartans themselves aspired to be. Unlike other Greek city-states, Sparta lacked a central urban hub that resembled the more cosmopolitan layouts of cities like Athens or Corinth. It was not built with grandeur or convenience in mind, but with utility and survival. The urban area was, in fact, a loose collection of 5 villages that gradually merged together over time. Pitane, Messoa, Limnae, Cynosura, and Amyclae. They remained somewhat distinct even as the Spartan state solidified, resulting in a decentralized layout that was oddly unceremonious for a society so deeply committed to order and discipline. The city had no protective walls until the later centuries of its existence. The Spartans believed that their best defense was their own military prowess, not stone. A belief that was noble in sentiment but deeply impractical from a civil engineering standpoint. Visitors from other poleis often remarked upon this absence with surprise, or perhaps judgment thinly veiled as admiration. The city seemed to defy the typical trappings of Greek urbanism. There were no elaborate marketplaces, no monumental temples dominating a high acropolis, and no bustling port area. What existed instead was a scattered network of simple homes, training grounds, barracks, and state buildings, each one built for function, rarely for beauty. The Eurotas River, for all its quiet meandering, was central to the region's agriculture. The fertile plains surrounding it produced olives, grain, and modest vineyards, most of which were worked not by Spartan citizens, but by the enslaved Helo population. From a strategic standpoint, the river provided a modest natural resource for the Spartans to ignore most of the time, unless it was being used for bathing, irrigation, or quietly judging travelers who expected a more scenic water feature. The climate of Sparta was Mediterranean, in the most standard sense hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. It provided an environment where year-round agricultural work was possible, and outdoor military training could be pursued with few interruptions. There were no snowstorms to hide behind, no foggy mornings to justify staying in. The sun shone with a kind of regular, unsympathetic brightness which reflected rather poetically off the bronzed helmets and spears of Sparta's hoplites. The architecture was minimal. Buildings were constructed from local stone and timber. Decoration was sparse. Where other Greek cities might favor colored friezes, finely carved columns, or ornate civic centers, Sparta's aesthetic choices leaned toward the severe and the undecorated. One could walk through the city for some time before encountering a structure that might be called impressive, and even then, the impressiveness was more ideological than architectural. The Temple of Artemis, Orthia, one of the few significant religious structures, was known less for its splendor and more for the ritual floggings that took place nearby. The agoras, the traditional Greek marketplaces that served as centers of commerce and civic life, were present in a technical sense, but they lacked the lively, chaotic energy of their counterparts in more mercantile cities. Trade was limited. Coins were discouraged. The economy operated largely through state control and the labor of helots, and so the agora in Sparta was less a hub of daily commerce and more a place where occasional supplies could be doled out or stern conversations could be had in few words. Roads in Sparta were dusty, practical, and unassuming. There were no triumphal avenues, no processional routes lined with statues. You walked where you needed to walk, generally in silence, ideally with good posture, and preferably toward military training. The streets did not bustle. They did not wind. They existed simply because they had to. Visitors from other parts of Greece often found the Spartan layout disorienting. There was no grand narrative told through the architecture. No symmetry, no romantic courtyards or echoing colonnades. The physical city mirrored the philosophy of the people, restrained, self-controlled, skeptical of comfort, and allergic to extravagance. At night, the city was quiet. Very quiet. The soundscape consisted largely of footsteps on dry earth, the occasional murmur of training from a distant field, or the soft rustling of reeds along the Eurotas. If there were parties, they were whispered. If there were street musicians, they had been forcibly relocated to Athens centuries prior. In this space between the mountains, under the Spartan sun, beside the narrow river, society evolved that rejected the luxuries of urban life. The very layout of Sparta was a quiet protest against what other Greeks called civilization. It was a city that turned its back on the marble ornaments of culture and instead looked inward toward discipline, conformity, and unrelenting physical hardship. It would not have impressed the average tourist, but then again, the average tourist would not have made it past the first meal, let alone through the night. Part 2. Morning in Sparta. Get up, get hard. 20 minutes. Spartan austerity was not merely a lifestyle choice, but a deeply embedded cultural doctrine. It permeated every aspect of life, from architecture and clothing to conversation and thought. To be Spartan was not to live simplet, was to live with the conviction that simplicity was a moral imperative. Excess was not just discouraged, it was considered corrosive to the state. This was a society that built its identity not around abundance, but around the purposeful absence of it. The word Spartan has come down through history as shorthand for frugality, and for good reason. In Sparta, luxury was seen as weakness. Comfort was considered a threat to unity and discipline. The ultimate goal of Spartan society was the preservation of the state through strength, and strength could only be achieved, they believed, by stripping life down to its bare, sinewy essentials. This philosophy extended well beyond personal possessions. It defined relationships, speech, food, leisure, and even thought itself. Spartan children were raised to believe that restraint was not just admirable, it was expected. Speaking too much was seen as a form of indulgence. Eloquence was unnecessary. Silence, or laconic brevity, was ideal. Indeed, the term laconic comes from Laconia, the region in which Sparta was located. A true Spartan would not give a long speech when a single word or, preferably, a grunted nod would suffice. Long-windedness was for Athenians, poets, and philosophers. Spartans had no time for abstraction when they could be lifting something heavy or enduring minor trauma in stoic silence. Material wealth, where it existed, was hidden or shunned. In fact, for much of Spartan history, currency was deliberately impractical. The state famously outlawed gold and silver coinage and instead introduced cumbersome iron bars as legal tender. These were not convenient little coins that could be tucked into a pouch. They were deliberately large and difficult to transport. The goal was to make hoarding money as inconvenient as possible. If you were wealthy, you were expected not to act like it. Ideally, you weren't supposed to be wealthy in the first place. Clothing followed a similar principle. Spartan garments were plain and unadorned. There was no fashion in Sparta, only uniformity. Citizens were expected to dress modestly and ideally identically. Boys and men often wore a single cloak, known as a himation, and no shoes. Going barefoot wasn't a stylistic choice, it was a philosophical one. Why encase your feet in luxury when the hard earth could teach you resilience? Girls and women wore tunics that allowed them freedom of movement. While this shocked other Greek states, it was entirely consistent with Spartan values, functionality above all else. Food was no exception to the rule of austerity. Spartan cuisine was notoriously dreadful. The most infamous dish was melosomos, or black broth, a concoction of boiled pork, salt, vinegar, and blood. The vinegar was not for flavor, but to prevent the blood from coagulating. The result was a thin, sour, iron-rich soup that modern palates might interpret as a punishment. And indeed, in many ways, it was. Spartan meals were communal affairs, eaten in Sicilian military dining messes. Citizens were required to eat together, regardless of rank or wealth. Meals were simple, repetitive, and devoid of ceremony. Eating alone or indulging in delicacies was viewed with suspicion. Culinary pleasure was not the point. Sustenance, equality, and discipline were. Even architecture and domestic life reflected this austerity. Spartan homes were plain, constructed with minimal ornamentation. The idea was not to impress guests, but to blend into the broader moral landscape of restraint. Furniture was utilitarian. Decor was rare. Walls were unadorned, not out of carelessness, but out of conviction. Beauty was seen as distraction. Comfort was seen as softness. The home was not a refuge of personal expression. It was merely a structure in which one could briefly rest before returning to training, governance, or war. Education, too, was stripped of what other Greek cities might call enrichment. While Athenians taught their youth philosophy, music, and the arts, Spartans taught obedience, endurance, and martial skill. Young boys entered the Agogatha state-sponsored training program around the age of 7. There they learned to read and write just enough to follow orders and no more. Intellectual curiosity was not encouraged. Mental discipline was. Questioning authority was dangerous. Thinking too much was considered inefficient, if not outright treasonous. The arts, such as they existed, served the state. Music was allowed, but it was martial and rhythmic, intended to coordinate marching or elevate morale before battle. Poetry was tolerated if it glorified Spartan values. Sculpture and painting were minimal. Dance existed, but only in the form of collective, regimented displays that mimicked combat. Individual expression was not only discouraged, it was structurally erased from most aspects of daily life. Religion in Sparta was similarly utilitarian. The gods were not petitioned for wealth or pleasure, but for victory and strength. Rituals were conducted with discipline, not exuberance. The cult of Artemis Orthia was one of the most prominent religious institutions, known less for its spiritual introspection and more for the whipping of young boys as a public endurance test. Religious festivals were celebrated, but with an eye toward their usefulness in reinforcing collective discipline. Piety, like everything else in Sparta, was not about feeling, it was about performing. Even leisure was regulated. Free time was not encouraged, and when it occurred, it was often filled with exercise, training, or state-approved conversations. Spartan citizens were expected to engage in communal affairs, not private amusements. Individual hobbies were rare. The concept of having a personal interest was, to put it gently, unfashionable. One's identity was inseparable from one's duty to the state. You did not find yourself in Sparta, you were forged into what the state required you to be, and anything else was wasteful. This cultural mindset was maintained through a constant tension between the individual and the collective. The state came first, family came second, if at all. Love, friendship, and ambition were filtered through the lens of usefulness to the greater Spartan ideal. To speak your mind was risky. To seek comfort was shameful. To desire more than you were allotted was nearly heretical. This wasn't just a way of life, it was a form of social engineering on a massive scale. The entire Spartan system was built to eliminate variance. Variance, after all, meant unpredictability, and unpredictability could lead to weakness. Spartan austerity was not a reflection of poverty, nor was it accidental. It was a choice reaffirmed daily, taught to every child, and woven into the very fabric of public and private life. In modern terms, it might seem bleak, but for the Spartans, this simplicity was sacred. It was strength distilled into culture. The absence of luxury was not a hardship, it was proof of superiority. The less you needed, the more Spartan you were, and ideally, you needed almost nothing at all. In Sparta, the day began not with the gentle chime of a bell or the sweet song of birds fluttering in olive trees. No, the Spartan wake-up call was a far cry from anything that might be described as peaceful or tender. It was, in effect, the first test of the die, a reminder that life was war, and you were already running late. Spartan society was designed around vigilance and physical readiness, and that began the moment your eyes opened, if indeed they had closed at all. The exact details of the wake-up process varied depending on age, status, and the stage of life you were in. But one thing was certain, sleeping in was not an option. Nor was soft bedding, a gentle alarm, or a leisurely stretch. Children in the Agoge, the Spartan state-run education and training system, typically awoke before sunrise. The wake-up call was not a gentle nudge from a caregiver, but more often the sharp voice of a supervising elderer, as they were formerly known, the paedonomos. This man was less of a teacher and more of a disciplinarian, tasked with shaping boys into future soldiers through a combination of instruction, surveillance, and a generous application of physical correction. If you were lucky, he barked orders. If you were unlucky, he did it with a stick. The boys slept in shared quarters, usually on bedding that amounted to little more than a pile of reeds. These were not plush mattresses or even straw-filled sacks. They were reeds pulled from the banks of the Eurotas River, which the boys had to gather themselves without knives. This was considered part of the training. Gathering with bare hands toughened them, apparently, and the occasional slice or bruise was a welcomed bonus in the endless pursuit of fortitude. There was no pillow. There was no blanket. The climate in Laconia could be surprisingly chilly at night, but shivering was a valuable learning experience. Waking up in this environment was not about slowly adjusting to the day. There was no yawning and checking the time. There was no breakfast in bed fantasy. You were expected to spring up, dress quickly, and be ready for inspection or immediate physical activity. Hesitation was punished, and punishment could be anything from extra training to beatings to simple public humiliation of Sparta's favorite teaching tools. Dignity was a privilege earned through endurance. The philosophy behind this wake-up ritual, like most things in Sparta, was rooted in the belief that hardship created strength. Comfort was seen as a kind of poison subtle, insidious, and thoroughly un-Spartan. By beginning the day in a state of immediate readiness, Spartans were reminded that every moment of life was preparation for war, and even sleep should not be indulged in too heavily. Indeed, oversleeping was seen as a moral failing. It suggested a softness of character that could not be tolerated. For the adult male citizens Spartiates, the expectations did not lessen with age. Though they no longer lived in the agog and had, in theory, earned a place of seniority in society, they were still part of the perpetual military machine. Spartan men, even in their full adulthood, continued to live communally in barracks until at least the age of 30, and sometimes well beyond. The morning wake-up call was still a group affair, abrupt, impersonal, and mandatory. Discipline did not ease with maturity, it deepened. By the time the sun crested the Taygetus Mountains, a Spartan man had likely already exercised, eaten a modest ration, and perhaps received instructions for the day's duties. He might patrol the Helot population, oversee the training of boys, or prepare for a campaign. The point was not variety or stimulation. Spartans did not prize novelty. They prized predictability, consistency, and complete obedience. Women, meanwhile, lived apart from this military system, but they were not exempt from early rising or disciplined living. Spartan girls were expected to train physically, just as the boys did. They were raised to be the mothers of warriors, which meant their bodies were expected to be strong, their minds clear, and their habits austere. Though they lived in private homes rather than barracks, Spartan women rose early and trained regularly. They were not coddled. They were not ornamental. They were expected to be formidable in their own way, capable of producing and raising strong sons and governing domestic affairs with rigor and control. The cultural attitude toward sleep itself was tinged with suspicion. Sleep was necessary, yes, but indulgence in it was not. Excessive sleep was linked with laziness, and laziness with weakness. There were no siestas, there were no naps, there were no dreams. At least none you'd be foolish enough to speak of. A Spartan who dreamed of a life of ease would be better off keeping it to himself ideally forever. The only time a Spartan might expect a reprieve from the rigor of the wake-up call was in old age, and even that was not guaranteed. Aged Spartans were respected for their contributions and endurance, but even in later life, the expectation of temperance and discipline persisted. To grow old in Sparta was not to retreat into relaxation. but to serve as a living example of lifelong severity. Historical records suggest that Spartans did not engage in extensive nighttime activity. With no need for festivals, feasts, or revelry, the night was reserved for quiet, sometimes interrupted by night training or patrols, particularly if helots were suspected of brewing discontent. Spartan nights were as disciplined as the days, and sleep was viewed not as a sanctuary, but as another battlefield zone where you were either ready to wake and fight, or you were a liability. There was, of course, a broader strategic logic to this relentless dawn discipline. In battle, surprise attacks often came at first light. A soldier who was groggy, slow to rise, or fumbling with his gear could jeopardize an entire phalanx. The discipline of waking quickly and moving with purpose wasn't just cultural, it was tactical. The phalanx, Sparta's military formation of overlapping shields and synchronized movement, depended on the group being perfectly in sync. That synchronization began at the very start of the day. Even the absence of alarm devices was intentional. Time in Sparta was not managed by bells or water clocks. It was regulated by habit, environment, and sheer internal discipline. You woke because you had to, not because something told you to. The internalization of the state's rhythms was part of becoming a true Spartan. Your body became the clock, your habits the gears. Thus, the Spartan wake-up call was not a moment. It was a daily reaffirmation of the cultural code, that comfort was corrosive, that vigilance was survival, and that the first breath of the day should already be half a battle cry. If you were lucky, you'd rise before the command. If you weren't, someone would make sure you did, and probably with a boot to the ribs. In Sparta, even sleep bowed to the state. 2. Hygiene and grooming. In Sparta, hygiene and grooming were not matters of personal vanity. They were, as with all things in this rigorously disciplined society, political, acts expressions of strength, utility, and above all, conformity. Personal cleanliness was not about comfort or pleasure, but about fitness, discipline, and readiness. You washed not to feel refreshed, but because a dirty soldier was a liability. You groomed yourself not to look good, but to look like everyone else. In the Spartan worldview, your body was not your own, it was property of the state, and it had to be maintained accordingly. Bathing, for example, was neither indulgent nor particularly pleasant. The Spartans did bathe, contrary to popular myths that paint them as unwashed brutes, but they did so with purpose and restraint. Unlike their Athenian neighbors, who often luxuriated in public bathhouses with oils, perfumes, and leisurely chatter, the Spartans approached cleanliness with the same minimalist fervor they brought to every other aspect of life. A Spartan bath was brisk, functional, and entirely devoid of comfort. Hot water was considered decadent. Cold water ice cold in winter no less was preferred. It shocked the system, hardened the flesh, and avoided any creeping suggestion of softness. Soap, in the modern sense, was rare. Instead, Spartans used abrasive softened sand or ash mixed with water to scrub themselves clean. These acted as natural exfoliants and symbolized, in a way, the entire Spartan approach to self-maintenance, coarse, effective, and utterly joyless. It wasn't about pampering. It was about scraping off weakness, both literal and metaphorical. Body hair was a mixed subject. Spartan men did not concern themselves with elaborate grooming routines, and yet they were not entirely neglectful either. Hair, particularly long hair, was seen as a sign of pride and dignity in adulthood. It was considered a marker of full citizenship and a symbol of confidence. Once a young man completed his training and was recognized as a full Spartan citizen, he was permitted to grow his hair out in apparent contradiction until you understand the purpose. Long hair was not about vanity. It was meant to be intimidating. A properly groomed mane, stark against the crimson Spartan cloak and bronze helmet, was intended to strike fear into the enemy. This was no romantic flowing coif. It was a lion's mane, carefully maintained for the battlefield. But even this permitted hair was kept in line. Grooming was expected to be meticulous. The soldier's body, though rugged, had to appear controlled. Beards were also common, but they too were regulated. There are historical accounts suggesting that disobedience in the ranks could result in a shaving as punishment, not because the Spartans valued facial hair per se, but because the loss of it was symbolic. It was a stripping away of manhood, an insult to the self-control and order that defined Spartan masculinity. Youth in the Agog had no such privileges. Their heads were typically shaved, or their hair closely cropped. This helped reinforce uniformity and removed any chance of expressing individuality. Everyone looked the same. Everyone smelled vaguely of cold water and sand, and everyone, by design, blended into the rigid symmetry of the Spartan order. Scent was another topic on which Sparta stood alone among the Greek city-states. Perfume was absolutely forbidden. The use of aromatic oils, so popular among other Hellenic cultures, was considered degenerate in Sparta. Smelling pleasant was equated with softness. If you were strong, you didn't need to mask your natural odor. You needed only to endure and expect others to do the same. That said, the Spartans were not completely indifferent to cleanliness. They did take steps to avoid being foul, but those steps ended precisely where indulgence began. Nails were trimmed, not polished. Skin was kept free of sores or infection because an unfit body was a danger to the phalanx, not because blemishes were unsightly. Teeth were, to the extent possible, kept clean with chewed twigs or coarse fabric. There were no whitening rituals, no smiling competitions, and certainly no elaborate dental hygiene. If your teeth worked and didn't get infected, they were good enough. Anything more was frivolous. Foot hygiene was ironically important for a people who famously went barefoot. Since Spartan boys and men trained and marched without sandals or shoes, their feet were constantly exposed to the element stones, heat, cold, thorns, and worse. Toughened soles were considered a point of pride. Blisters, cuts, and bruises were routine and not worth mentioning. But infections were another matter. So Spartans would clean their feet with extra attention, sometimes using vinegar or salt water to disinfect wounds. It was, once again, not about comfort, but survival. A soldier could not limp in formation. The phalanx had no room for weak links. Women in Sparta, while not part of the military machine, were nonetheless expected to uphold the same values of physical discipline and hygiene. Female grooming, where it existed, revolved around health and strength. There is little evidence that Spartan women painted their faces, styled their hair in elaborate fashions, or wore jewelry for decorative purposes. Beauty was not something you enhanced, it was something that radiated from health, posture, and confidence. A Spartan woman was supposed to be imposing, not dainty. Her grooming reflected this. There's a curious practicality to the entire Spartan hygiene regimen. Every element, however severe, was directed toward a single goal: usefulness. Clean bodies were healthy bodies. Healthy bodies were strong bodies. Strong bodies served the state. Anything that fell outside of that logic was ignored, banned, or ridiculed. Grooming had to be functional. It had to serve the group. There was no room for personal style, no time for luxury, and no tolerance for vanity. This philosophy extended into public expectations as well. It wasn't just about how you kept yourself, it was how others saw you. A disheveled Spartan was a shame to the community, not because he looked bad, but because it suggested a lapse in discipline. Cleanliness was not pride in oneself, but pride in Sparta. If you couldn't keep your own body in order, how could you be trusted to hold the line in battle? Ultimately, hygiene in Sparta was not about personal care. It was national service at the level of skin and bone. Your body was a weapon. Like any weapon, it needed to be kept sharp, clean, and ready. And woe to the Spartan who mistook that care for comfort or dared to seek pleasure in it. You could scrub yourself clean, but you'd better not enjoy it. 3. Breakfast. A sad affair. Breakfast in Sparta was not so much a meal as it was a brief negotiation with starvation, a begrudging nod to bodily necessity, a moment in which sustenance was provided, though never enjoyed. The morning meal in this austere city-state was deliberately underwhelming, bordering on punitive. It was not intended to comfort, satisfy, or energize in any modern sense. Rather, it served as a stark reminder. Your body was a tool, not a temple. It deserved only what was required to keep moving. Spartans, famously, did not indulge in culinary flourishes. This was true across all meals, but particularly evident at breakfast. Whereas Athenians might start their day with bread dipped in wine, fruit, olives, or even a dollop of cheese, the Spartan breakfast was more a test of endurance than a gastronomic experience. It was, as one might expect by now, an exercise in doing more with less and ideally, feeling guilty for even that. For boys in the Agoj, breakfast was designed to be just barely sufficient. The food was intentionally sparse and nutritionally modest, meant to leave the boys slightly hungry. This, according to Spartan logic, encouraged resourcefulness. Hunger, they believed, sharpened the senses. It made you alert. It taught you not to grow comfortable or reliant on abundance. If a boy wanted more food, he was expected to steal it. But if caught, he wasn't punished for theft, but was punished for being sloppy enough to get caught. The lesson was not just about hunger, but cunning. A Spartan must be both lean and clever, and mealtime was just another opportunity to reinforce that dual mandate. So what, then, did this meal consist of? Typically a piece of coarse barley bread, often hard, dry, and unflavored, paired with diluted wine. This wine was not consumed for pleasure. It was heavily watered down, tart, and functional. Spartan wine was more antiseptic than aperitif, consumed to kill bacteria in the water and to maintain hydration. Sweetness was neither expected nor desired. It was thought that strong, undiluted wine made men weak, emotional, or worse, Athenian. The barley bread, called maza, was dense, chewy, and made with as little refinement as possible. It could be soaked in the wine to soften it, or chewed slowly to extract the limited calories it provided. On occasion, a small helping of figs or olives might be included, especially if these were in season. But even then, the portions were minimal. Spartan philosophy frowned upon fullness. Feeling full was suspicious, indulgent. A warrior who walked away from a meal feeling satisfied was surely on the road to ruin. Adults, particularly full citizens, Spartiates did not receive much more. Their morning meal, like everything else in their lives, was a matter of routine and restraint. A bite of bread, a swallow of wine, perhaps a piece of dried meat, salted to ensure it lasted longer than it tasted good. There were no morning feasts, no family breakfasts, no communal banter around a kitchen hearth. In Sparta, meals were usually silent. Speech was restricted. Frivolous conversation was discouraged. You were there to eat, not to express yourself. and certainly not to enjoy yourself. The communal structure of Spartan life also meant that individual preferences were irrelevant. You didn't get to request more olives or less wine. There were no dietary adjustments, no allergies accommodated, and no special exceptions for picky eaters. You ate what everyone else ate, or you ate nothing at all. This was part of the broader cultural project, to suppress the self in favor of the group. Even taste was subordinated to conformity. Interestingly, while food was sparse, it was not wasted. Spartan frugality extended to every crumb. Leftovers were uncommon not because meals were so delicious they were devoured entirely, but because they were portioned with grim precision. Everyone received just enough to function, and not an ounce more. Wastefulness was antithetical to the Spartan ideal. Resources were finite, and anything more than necessity was luxury. And luxury, as ever, was dangerous. Spartan women and girls followed similar patterns. Though they did not eat in the military messes and barracks like the men, their meals were also modest and practical. They were allowed to eat with their families or in the home, but the rules of restraint still applied. A Spartan girl might have a piece of bread, some goat cheese if available, or perhaps a fig. Like the boys, they were expected to eat enough to maintain strength and no more. For them, too, breakfast was a moment of duty, not pleasure. Even the environment in which breakfast was consumed reflected Spartan priorities. There was no dining area designed for comfort or relaxation. No cushions, no music, no lazy morning sun streaming through windows. Meals were taken, standing or seated on plain stools. The idea of reclining, as was common in other Greek cities, was seen as effeminate and inappropriate. Reclining while eating was something Athenians did, perhaps while discussing poetry or sipping sweet wine. Spartans would sooner chew bark. Breakfast, then, was a somber affair. It was the sustenance of obligation, a reminder, first thing in the morning, that you were not here to thrive but to endure. The first quiet reinforcement of the day's message. Your body must serve the city, and the city owes your body nothing but what it needs to march. The simplicity of the Spartan breakfast served as a metaphor for the society at large. It was stripped of embellishment, stripped of warmth, stripped of anything that might resemble a moment of self-indulgence. You chewed your bread, drank your wine, and moved on. There was training to complete, discipline to uphold, enemies to prepare for, and absolutely no time for jam, honey, or second helpings. So if you're picturing yourself in Sparta, bleary-eyed and rising to greet the dawn and expect a cup of coffee, don't expect bacon or eggs, or a pleasant chat with your family over porridge. Expect a crust of hard bread, a sip of sour wine, and the realization that this is the best it's going to get today. And perhaps, if you're lucky, you'll still be hungry enough to sharpen your instincts. Because in Sparta, that was the point. 4. Inspection and discipline. Inspection in Sparta was less about assessing and more about judging. It was the daily ritual in which your body, your posture, your grooming, your expression, and even your silence were scrutinized not for excellence, but for deviation. If you were different, you were wrong. If you were soft, you were dangerous. And if you thought for a moment that you might slip by unnoticed, you were already in trouble. The morning inspection was not a formality. It was a core component of the Spartan system of constant surveillance and discipline. It occurred early, immediately after the meager breakfast, and it was not something to be taken lightly. Every boy in the Agoge Sparta's state-run training system for male youth was subject to it. There was no hiding behind a crowd, no blending in when your entire identity had already been forcefully homogenized. Even in a world of uniformity, the smallest imperfection could draw attention, and attention in Sparta was not what you wanted. Inspectors, usually older boys who had already advanced within the system or adults appointed by the state, would walk the rows of youths and examine them closely. They checked for cleanliness, posture, physical condition, and demeanor. Were you shaved properly? Was your cloak in order? Had your sandals, if you were lucky enough to have them that day, been fastened correctly? Were your arms and legs marked by laziness, or were they sufficiently toughened from yesterday's drills and hardships? Punishments were handed out with the same ease as observations. A boy who was too clean might be accused of vanity. A boy who looked too pleased might be accused of idleness. Too fat? Gluttonous? Too thin? Weak. The goal was never perfection, it was endurance. You weren't supposed to look good. You were supposed to look ready. Ready to suffer, ready to obey, and ready to endure the next demand placed upon you. Perhaps most tellingly, these inspections were also a performance in silence. The boys were not allowed to speak unless spoken to. They were expected to respond to corrections or criticism without protest. Stoicism wasn't just admired, it was enforced. If a boy winced under reprimand, he might be punished for it. If he cried, doubly so. Tears were proof that the training had not yet penetrated deeply enough. Emotional restraint was a benchmark of maturity. Your body might betray pain, but your face must never admit it. This quiet performance extended to posture. Boys stood straight, not just because it was proper, but because it signaled discipline. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward, even if those eyes had not slept well the night before. Slouching was not a sign of fatigue, it was insubordination. In Sparta, even gravity was an enemy to resist. The physical condition of the boys was closely monitored. Bruises were expected, even praised, provided they came from sanctioned training. But injuries that revealed clumsiness, cowardice, or a lack of control were frowned upon. A boy limping due to his own incompetence was not given sympathy. He was reprimanded for being a potential liability. In the Spartan worldview, a soldier who could not maintain his own health was unlikely to protect his phalanx partner in battle. And so the inspection was not just about hygiene or readiness, it was about ideological compliance. It was about reinforcing every single morning that your body was not private property. It was not an instrument of personal exploration or expression. It was a publicly scrutinized vessel of duty, and its every feature was measured against the harsh metric of state usefulness. Girls, though not part of the agoge, were not exempt from discipline or inspection, though their experience was different. Spartan girls were raised to be strong, both in body and spirit, and their physical conditioning was a point of civic pride. They too were expected to maintain health, strength, and poise. They too were judged not by charm or beauty, but by function. Could they run, wrestle, bear children without fear or complaint? A Spartan girl did not giggle and twirl. She trained, stood tall, and met her elders' gaze without flinching. Among the adult citizen population, inspections did not cease. Spartan men were subject to communal oversight throughout their lives. While their daily routines were less rigorously monitored than those of the youths, the cultural expectation of discipline remained firmly in place. Their bearing, their tone, even the way they walked through the agora or addressed their peers was evaluated. A grown man who showed signs of indulgence or vanity risked public disgrace. And public disgrace in Sparta was worse than punishment. It was shame visible, enduring, and almost impossible to shed. Spartan society maintained a uniquely effective system of peer enforcement. Because everyone was responsible for watching everyone else, the need for private enforcement mechanisms was minimized. Your neighbor might report you. Your messmate might correct you. Your friend, if you had such a thing in Sparta, might rebuke you for softening. Discipline was everyone's business, and personal privacy was nearly non-existent. Interestingly, this all-consuming scrutiny created an internalized mechanism of control. Spartan citizens began to anticipate the expectations. They inspected themselves before others had the chance. They corrected their own postures, their own tones, their own behaviors because they understood the consequences of failure were not just personal, they were collective. Your error could bring shame on your mess group, your unit, your family, your city. And so the inspection became something more than a morning ritual. It became a way of life. A quiet moment that encapsulated the entire Spartan experience. You rose from your wooden pallet, ate your coarse bread in silence, and stood for judgment. Not because you wanted to, but because that was what was expected of you. You steeled your face against the cold, braced your back against the eyes that examined you, and made yourself invisible by being correct. There was no praise for passing the inspection, no reward for doing things right. The highest compliment a Spartan could receive was no criticism at all. Silence was approval. Absence of punishment was validation. And so each morning began not with comfort or joy, but with the fragile hope that you might escape notice, that you might, in your uniformity, disappear just long enough to survive another day. Because in Sparta, perfection was not excellence, it was invisibility. And discipline wasn't something you learned, it was something you became. Part 2. Daily Duties and Training. 1. The agoge in action. To understand daily life in Sparta, one must understand the agoge. Not merely a school, and certainly not a place of childhood frolic, the agoge was an institutionalized machine for churning out obedient, durable, and highly disciplined soldiers. It was not about education in the traditional sense. There were no debates about learning styles, no passionate lectures about ethics or science. The only real curriculum was hardship. The agoge was mandatory for all male Spartan citizens, beginning at the age of 7. From that point onward, a boy ceased to be a child of his parents and became a child of the state. Biological family ties were of secondary importance. The polis, the city, was now mother and father. The agoge made this transition brutally clear. Boys were taken from their homes and assigned to pax cohorts known as herds or agili. These were their new families, their brothers in endurance. What followed, day after day, was a relentless barrage of physical training, mental discipline, and social conditioning. Morning gave way to exercises. Running, wrestling, jumping, mock battles with wooden weapons or bare fists. And if the blows were too real, too harsh, so much the better. The Spartans believed pain was educational. The body learned quickest when it suffered. Clothing was minimal. In most seasons, the boys wore a single cloak, coarse and unwashed. In winter, they went barefoot and often bare-legged. Cold was not a deterrent, it was a tool. Comfort was viewed as corrosive. If your feet bled from frozen ground, that was a lesson in resilience. If your hands blistered from the rough grain of a wooden spear, that was just the price of eventual competence. You were not learning how to survive war. You were being made into someone who would not notice it. Education, such as it was, came in thin doses. Reading and writing were taught, but only just enough to function. Rhetoric, however, was given more importantino, the elaborate speeches of Athenian orators, but terse, cutting remarks. Spartans admired laconism, concise speech delivered with deadly precision. A true Spartan did not need many words, just one, if it was the right one. Discipline, predictably, was severe. Infractions, whether speaking out of turn, failing to keep posture, or showing hesitation in training, were met with beatings. These were not rare events. Beatings were daily, common, expected. There was no formal complaint process. Pain was simply another form of instruction, and boys were taught to accept it without flinching. The ideal response to punishment was not an apology, but silence. Older boys were encouraged to dominate younger ones. This was not bullying, it was pedagogy. The system was hierarchical and deliberately so. Younger boys learned submission, deference, and obedience. Older boys learned command, assertiveness, and brutality. They became the inspectors, the enforcers, the models of what the system expected. There was no graduation. There was only transformation. Another feature of the agoj was constant hunger. As mentioned earlier, boys were deliberately underfed. Their stomachs growled throughout the day. They were encouraged to steal, not to satisfy gluttony, but to hone stealth and cunning. Caught stealing, punished not for theft, but for failure. The ideal Spartan boy was hungry, lean, and resourceful. A soft stomach was a moral failure. The training was not purely physical. Boys were also taught songs martial hymns extolling valor and death. These were not lullabies. They were chants for marching into battle. You learn not just how to swing a sword, but how to die well. Cowardice was the only true sin. A boy could be clumsy, slow, even foolish, but he could not be afraid. Fear was not to be conquered. It was to be excised. Another crucial component of the agoj was surveillance. Boys were always being watched, by instructors, by older students, by each other. Privacy was a foreign concept. Every action had consequences, and most of those consequences involved pain or public shaming. Even rest was closely monitored. Too long in one spot, sluggish. Too relaxed, complacent. Every movement was part of the test. As the boys aged, their training intensified. At 12, they lost their cloaks entirely. They were now fully naked through the seasons. They slept on reeds, cut from riverbanks with their bare hands. The idea was not just to endure suffering, but to stop noticing it, to strip away even the desire for ease. If a boy complained, he was seen as a defective flaw in the model. And flaws, in Sparta, were not tolerated. Mentorship was also part of the agoj, though the nature of these relationships remains the subject of considerable historical debate. Older Spartan men often took on a younger protege, offering guidance, training, and, in some accounts, intimate companionship. These relationships were meant to cement loyalty, discipline, and ideological indoctrination. The precise nature of these bonds varied, but they were always tied to hierarchy and obedience. Affection, if it existed, was never allowed to supersede duty. One might imagine a Spartan boy looking forward to adulthood, where the trials of the agoj might give way to autonomy. He would be disappointed. The agoj never truly ended. It simply transitioned into adulthood, where discipline was self-imposed, and every man became an inspector of his peers. There was no off switch, only deeper integration into the system. And so, the agoj functioned not just as a training regimen, but as a cultural forge. It produced citizens who did not question, who did not flinch, who did not expect kindness, and therefore never missed it. A boy who survived the agoj had been hollowed out and rebuilt. What remained was not a person, exactly, but a part, a living, breathing cog in Sparta's grim machinery. So if you, modern sleeper, imagine yourself in this environment surrounded by sandaled inspectors, with bruises still blooming from yesterday's drills, hungry, cold, and watched from every angle, ask yourself if you'd make it to lunchtime. The agoj did not tolerate doubt. It did not reward creativity. It made men who could kill without hesitation. and boys who, after 7 years of brutality, no longer knew how to dream of anything else. 2. Military drills and physical conditioning. If the agoge was the philosophical foundation of Spartan upbringing, then military drills were its daily reaffirmation, brutally repetitive, painstakingly precise, and entirely devoid of entertainment. From early adolescence through adulthood, every Spartan male's day was marked by physical rigor and martial repetition. You did not work out in Sparta. You molded yourself endlessly into a machine of war. Drills began with simplicity marching in formation, learning to move in rhythm, shoulder to shoulder, heel to toe, without breaking step or line. The goal was not self-expression. There were no spontaneous lunges or bursts of flair. In Sparta, cohesion was the highest art. Every man had to move as if controlled by a single mind. Precision was sacred, individuality suspect. The cornerstone of this practice was the phalanxa dense, disciplined formation of shields and spears. It was both the heart of Spartan battle doctrine and the very soul of its training. The young trained relentlessly to march in step, to pivot, to brace, to thrust with unified force. One break in the wall of shields and the formation could crumble. So, drills often revolved around the basic choreography of survival. Step forward, thrust, block, hold, retreatal in harmony, all without hesitation. Weapons training was methodical and unforgiving. Boys and men drilled with doru, the standard spear, and xiphos, the short sword, until these instruments became extensions of their own limbs. But finesse was not the objective. Spartan technique was about efficiency, not elegance. The enemy did not need to be disarmed. He needed to be impaled. Swords were short, because Spartans fought close. If you were far enough away to need a long blade, you were already doing it wrong. The shield, or aspis, was not just a defensive tool, it was a moral obligation. A Spartan could lose his helmet or breastplate without disgrace, but to lose one's shield was to abandon one's comrades. It was the linchpin of the phalanx. You held it not only for yourself, but for the man beside you. Daily drills thus involved the shield not only as protection, but as a constant burden, a heavy, circular reminder that your life was not your own. Drills were conducted in all weather. Rain was no excuse. Heat was irrelevant. The terrain varied: rocky fields, hillsides, open plains, because battle would not wait for level ground. Soldiers learned to fight uphill, downhill, and barefoot across gravel. It was better to bleed in training, the instructors assured, than to die in combat. Although in truth, bleeding in both was entirely acceptable. And these drills were never brief. Hours of exertion were the norm, not the exception. Fatigue was part of the exercise. Spartans did not believe in rest days. Soreness was weakness leaving the body. Sprains and strains were not injuries. They were opportunities to improve one's threshold for pain. Strength training, as we imagine it, today lifting, weights, repetitive sets, did not exist in the modern form. But Spartans lifted heavy things. They climbed, they carried stones, they sprinted up hills. They grappled. They practiced throwing the akonchon, a light javelin, and they hurled it not for sport but for accuracy. They did not train for bulk or aesthetics. Their physiques, famously lean and wiry, were built for endurance, speed, and the sheer ability to suffer. And then there was wrestling, the quintessential Spartan sport. It was not the ceremonial contest of other Greek city-states. In Sparta, wrestling was a violent, strategic, often brutal engagement meant to simulate hand-to-hand combat. Chokeholds, locks, throws all were fair game. Victory was less about pinning and more about dominance. You won by overwhelming your opponent, and by doing so with minimal flair. Flashiness was suspect. Function was king. Instructors, often former soldiers or senior trainees, walked among the ranks during these drills. Their presence was both ominous and motivating. They observed everything: your footwork, your reaction time, your sweat. If you were too slow, you were shamed. If you were too eager, you were corrected. Training wasn't just about learning the movements. It was about learning control. The Spartan soldier was not a berserker. He was a blade sharp, balanced, and utterly restrained until unleashed. Group exercises, too, were common. Entire cohorts would perform drills in formation, chanting rhythmically to coordinate movements. Songs were not just for morale, they were tools for timing. You learned to pace your march to the beat, to strike your shield in unison with your peers, to create the kind of noise that preceded Spartan victories. The sound of many boots moving, as one was not just intimidating it, was musical in its own grim way. Physical conditioning was not limited to battle readiness. It included tests of agility, endurance, and even pain tolerance. There were races, obstacle courses, and feats of balance that trained the body to function under duress. You might be ordered to run barefoot across a riverbed. You might be made to crawl under thorny bushes. You might simply be told to hold a plank position in the sun until your arms trembled. And then, just as you began to fail, you were told to stand. Failure, after all, was not an option. It was simply another test. Injury during training was not pitied. There were no medical waivers. If you were hurt, you were expected to adapt, limp with dignity, bandage it yourself, complain, and you invited a beating. Perseverance was the only metric that mattered. Unlike modern military training, which often distinguishes between body and mind, Spartan conditioning assumed no such divide. The body was the mind. If you could control one, you had control of the other. So when the body was made unbreakable, the spirit followed. And while all of this might sound harsh to the contemporary listener, the Spartans would not have recognized it as such. This was not cruelty. This was patriotism. Every drop of sweat and blood on the training field was offered in service to Sparta, not metaphorically, but literally. The city's strength was drawn from the muscle of its citizens, and so your daily suffering was considered both a duty and a gift. Indeed, to skip drill or show reluctance was not laziness, it was treason. It suggested you cared more for your own comfort than for the state. Such attitudes, if left unchecked, could spread, and Sparta had no room for ideologies other than obedience. So as midday approached in ancient Sparta, your muscles would be aching, your lungs burning, your palms perhaps raw from your shield. You would be smeared with dirt, likely blood, and possibly the remnants of a punishment you didn't quite earn. But you would not complain. You would stand in formation, eyes forward, and wait for the next command. Because this wasn't just training, it was your identity, and the only alternative to Spartan discipline was dishonor. 3. Punishments and correction methods. If there was one thing Sparta loved more than discipline, it was correcting those who fell short of it. Punishment was not a side effect of Spartan society, it was one of its foundational tools. A society built around obedience, order, and martial excellence had no room for deviation, and so correction was swift, constant, and rarely questioned. It was not about reform, as we might think of it today. In Sparta, correction meant realignment, bringing the errant body or mind back into conformity with the whole. Punishments were doled out liberally, often without much ceremony. For the Spartan, punishment was not necessarily a sign of moral failure, but an accepted and expected method of instruction. It was considered entirely normal for a child to be struck, an adolescent to be beaten, or an adult to be publicly shamed. Everyone, from boys in the agoges to grown men in the mess halls, was liable to be corrected if they so much as looked out of sync. In the agoge, punishment began early and usually began often. A child might be beaten for speaking out of turn, for fidgeting during a drill, for failing to maintain proper posture, or simply for appearing too relaxed. The instructors, often older boys or seasoned enforcers, were never short on reasons. And crucially, the why of the punishment was often less important than the how. The ritual of correction mattered. The lesson was in the experience, not the explanation. The favored tool of enforcement was the whip, not some elaborate, symbolic instrument, but a practical tool of pain. Its use was neither rare nor exceptional. Spartans beat their youth to toughen them, to humble them, to prepare them for a world in which kindness was in short supply. These beatings weren't hidden. They were public and often celebrated. Parents didn't interfere. In fact, Spartan mothers were known to encourage such discipline, their only concern being whether their child was strong enough to endure it without crying. Among the more infamous institutions was the diamastagosis, a public whipping ritual held at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. In this grim ceremony, boys were flogged sometimes to death as a demonstration of endurance and faith. It was part punishment, part initiation, part gruesome spectator sport. The boy who could withstand the longest beating without screaming or flinching earned respect. The one who collapsed or cried out, less so. It was a reminder that in Sparta, pain was not only tolerated, it was performative. Punishment extended beyond physical pain. Shame was also a potent tool. Public ridicule, ostracism, or being made to perform humiliating tasks were common corrective methods. If you were lazy in drill, you might be made to run laps with your cloak turned inside out, or forced to eat apart from your group. If you stole food and were caught, you were not only beaten, you were often made a cautionary tale to others. The lesson wasn't, don't steal, but don't get caught. Spartan punishments were not arbitrary, but they were intentionally unpredictable. You might be punished for something no one else noticed, or for something someone else got away with yesterday. This inconsistency was part of the system's brilliance. It cultivated a permanent state of vigilance. You were never safe, never completely at ease, and that was precisely the point. Among adults, correction took a more social form but was no less brutal. The ephors, a group of 5 annually elected magistrates, had the authority to punish even kings. Infractions, whether in battle readiness, moral conduct, or public behavior, could result in fines, demotion, or public disgrace. The military mess halls, where Spartan men dined and bonded, were also sites of judgment. If a man ate too greedily, told an off-color joke, or failed to keep his cloak neat, he might be called out in front of everyone. There were no private scoldings. Correction was always a communal experience. Even physical deformity or perceived weakness could be punished with exclusion. Infants deemed unfit were discarded at Mount Tagetusa process, euphemistically referred to as exposure. This, too, was a form of correction. The purification of the body politic, by removing the unfit before they could become a burden. The message was clear: Sparta did not fix weaknesses, it removed them. This harshness extended to women, albeit differently. Spartan girls were not part of the agoge, but they were raised with strict standards. If a girl was seen as lazy or cowardly, she could be ridiculed or excluded from prestigious roles, such as participating in festivals or athletic events. While physical punishment was less common for women, verbal correction and social pressure were just as potent. Spartan women were expected to be bold, commanding, and physically strong, not for their own sake, but to bear sons worthy of Sparta. A timid woman was a national liability. It's worth noting that there was very little in the way of forgiveness or reconciliation in Spartan correction. You didn't apologize, and you weren't forgiven. You endured, were corrected, and moved on. The goal was never emotional closure. It was behavior modification. If you were beaten for slouching, you didn't dwell on it. You stood up straighter. If you were mocked for speaking too much, you spoke less. The punishment was not about you, it was about the unit, the city, the ideal. Interestingly, despite all this brutality, many Spartans took a certain pride in being punished. To be whipped and not cry, to be shamed and not falter, these were considered signs of maturity. Punishment, in a twisted sense, was proof of participation. If you had never been corrected, perhaps you weren't trying hard enough. A truly Spartan soul welcomed correction as part of the lifelong crucible of becoming worthy. This, more than anything, may be what makes Spartan life so uninhabitable for the modern mind. We are a society obsessed with comfort, autonomy, and fairness. Spartan society cared for none of these. It was not concerned with feelings, nor with individuality, nor even with justice in any modern sense. It was concerned with outcomes, strength, unity, obedience. Everything else could be corrected or discarded. So if, during your imagined day in Sparta, you found yourself limping after a morning drill, or muttering a complaint under your breath, or even flinching at the whistle of a whip, you'd better hope no one noticed. Because in Sparta, the only thing worse than punishment was being thought unworthy of it. 4. Communal work and expectations. By now, your muscles ache, your spirit is likely frayed, and the sun stands high overhead, merciless and unamused. But Spartan life allows no reprieve. After the rigor of training and the sting of correction, you move on to yet another essential aspect of your day: communal work. Unlike many ancient societies where labor was largely relegated to the lower classes or enslaved populations, Sparta took a slightly different approach. While the Helotsa subjugated class native to Laconia and Messenia did indeed perform the bulk of agricultural labor that did not exempt full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, from contributing to the collective through other means. Communal work in Sparta was not about economic necessity. It was about reinforcing your role as part of the whole, a cog in a machine that permitted no rust. This work could take various forms. Sometimes it was physical, helping to repair communal buildings, maintaining training grounds, or overseeing the care of military equipment. At other times, it was supervisory, ensuring the helots were performing their duties or organizing the communal stores and rations. Tasks were assigned with minimal ceremony, and you were expected to complete them with even less fanfare. No one praised a Spartan for doing his job. Praise was for victory, not competence. Among the most symbolic of communal duties was the management of the Syssiathi, Spartan mess halls. Every Spartiate male was required to be part of one, and participation was not optional. These communal dining groups were more than meal-sharing arrangements. They were binding social contracts, small collectives within the larger collective. A Spartan man was expected to contribute to the mess with regular food offerings, usually sourced from the agricultural labor of his assigned helot population. But contributions were only part of it. The kitchen work preparing, organizing, rationing was communal too. This work was not beneath the dignity of a Spartan. In fact, it was essential to the ethic of shared austerity. You cooked, you cleaned, and you maintained the tools of your subsistence because you were no better than the man beside you. And if you failed to contribute or attempted to shirk responsibility, the punishment wasn't a slap on the wrist. It could be expulsion from the Syssitia, social death sentence in a city that lived and breathed collectivism. Adolescents, still immersed in the agoge, were often tasked with errands and oversight roles. They might be sent to fetch materials, oversee younger boys in minor tasks, or serve in roles akin to squires for adult warriors. This was considered part of their training, a way to instill humility and service. Every chore, no matter how menial, was a thread in the fabric of discipline. Women, though barred from formal citizenship, also participated in communal expectations just differently. Spartan women were not cloistered in domestic silence. They managed estates, organized supplies, and even participated in local governance related to household economics. Their role in overseeing the helots, ensuring agricultural productivity, and maintaining the family's obligations to the Syssitia was crucial. If they failed in these duties, the entire household would feel the consequences. In this way, even domestic management in Sparta became a form of civic labor. And then, of course, there was the matter of the helots. While Spartans did not typically perform agricultural labor themselves, they were deeply involved in managing the system that allowed it. Helots worked the fields, harvested the crops, and provided the produce that fed the city, but their lives were monitored closely. Spartans were expected to periodically inspect the helots, enforce order, and ensure submission. This surveillance, too, was communal work, an ever-vigilant network of oppression framed as civic duty. At times, this management took a darker turn. There existed a ritual known as the crypteia, often described as a secret police force comprised of the most promising young Spartans. Though interpretations vary, some sources claim these young men were tasked with executing particularly defiant helots or creating an atmosphere of fear to maintain Spartan dominance. Whether or not this was an institutionalized rite or simply sanctioned terror, the point remains. In Sparta, even murder could be a form of work if it served the collective. Outside of these structured obligations, communal work also meant upholding social expectations. You were expected to embody Spartan values at all times, walk with purpose, speak with economy. Maintain a stoic demeanor. There was no moment when you were off duty. There was no escape into personal hobbies or idle chatter. Leisure, in the modern sense, was non-existent. Time spent alone was time wasted. Time not in service to Sparta was borderline subversive. Even personal grooming, as sparse as it was considered part of your contribution to the collective image. A poorly maintained cloak or unkempt appearance reflected not only on you, but on your entire Syssitia. If your group looked disheveled, it was your failure too. Communal standards reached into every detail, binding even the smallest habits into a tight knot of shared accountability. And perhaps most exhausting of all was that you were expected to perform this work joylessly. Spartans did not cheer each other on. They did not high-five after finishing a task. Pride, if it existed, was inward and wordless. To express satisfaction in your own effort was to verge on arrogance. To demand recognition was to betray the very values you were meant to uphold. A Spartan did his part, quietly, efficiently, and without visible emotion. Anything more was indulgence, and indulgence in Sparta was weakness. So as you stand there, perhaps sweeping the edge of the training yard or overseeing a cart of grain bound for the communal stores, you feel the weight of invisible eyes, not just your peers, but your ancestors. The whole lineage of Sparta measuring you. You are not expected to be exceptional. You are expected to be identical, and that may be harder still. In the end, communal work in Sparta was not about building things or checking boxes. It was about dissolving the self into the city. about earning your continued place in a society that never once asked what you wanted, but always remembered whether you delivered. Part 3. Spartan Society and Structure. 1. Class Structure, Spartiates, Perioikoi, and Helots. To fully understand why you wouldn't survive a day in ancient Sparta, you must look beyond the physical trials and into the invisible architecture of the society itself fits class structure. Spartan life was not simply brutal. It was meticulously stratified. It was a tiered system of privilege, responsibility, and subjugation so rigid that even the smallest deviation from your assigned place could render you suspect, dangerous, or disposable. At the very top of this structure sat the Spartiates, also known as the homoioi literally, the equals. But do not let the term mislead you. These were not men made equal by democracy or fraternity. They were equal because the system declared them so, and only among themselves. Every Spartiate male had passed through the crucible of the agoge, had contributed to his syssitia, communal mess, and had retained both physical fitness and political standing. These were the full citizens of Sparta,